veranstalten wir das heute Abend hier nicht alleine als Deutscher Gewerkschaftsbund Frankfurt, sondern in Kooperation mit der Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung. Die haben auch schon in Berlin das Event mitorganisiert in der Volksbühne, wo Paul gestern war. Genau, da möchte ich auch nochmal einen Dank sagen, weil die sich auch ordentlich an den Kosten beteiligen und auch diese ganze Lesereise von Paul hier in Deutschland unterstützt haben. Genau, zudem gibt es draußen einen Büchertisch von der Büchergilde Gutenberg. Da könnt ihr Pauls aktuelles Buch, das jetzt gerade auf Deutsch erschienen ist, wer es von euch noch nicht gesehen hat, das mit dem roten Emergency-Button, könnt ihr erwerben, und Paul signiert nachher auch noch, also wenn ihr sozusagen signiertes Buch haben wollt, Paul ist dann noch eine Weile hier nach der Veranstaltung und signiert gerne auch Bücher für euch. Genau. Wir haben heute während der Veranstaltung Maskenpflicht, das hatte ich vorhin schon mal gesagt, also die Hälfte der Leute anwesend war. Es ist immer ein bisschen unkomfortabel, aber für uns war das so im Grunde genommen die Variante, in der wir das auch für uns verantworten konnten, diese Veranstaltung durchzuführen, weil Corona ist noch in der Welt und wir möchten alle für uns, für alle gemeinsam das Infektionsrisiko minimieren. Und es ist aber auch schön, dass wir jetzt wieder nach so einer langen Pause mit diesem ganzen Lockdown zusammenkommen können mit so vielen Leuten. Ich freue mich wirklich, dass ihr alle da seid. Es gibt sozusagen das moderierte Gespräch, es wird keine Lesung geben, sondern moderiertes Gespräch. Das wird auf Englisch stattfinden, everything will be in English. Danach gibt es dann noch die Möglichkeit, natürlich Fragen zu stellen. Und da würde ich jetzt schon mal vorausschicken, wir freuen uns selber auf Publikumsbeteiligung, dass wir es aber gerne auch kommunikativ halten wollen. Also ich würde euch bitten, später keine Co-Referate von 15 Minuten zu halten, den Leuten die Welt nochmal zu erklären, sondern das eher wirklich dialogisch zu halten, dass wir hier ein gutes Gespräch haben. So viel von meiner Seite. Ich hoffe, ich habe nichts Wichtiges vergessen. Und ich übergebe das Wort an dich, Klaus.
So, thanks very much, Alex,
Mach nochmal einen Hinweis auf
for your introduction. I'm very glad to have Paul with us this evening. Paul is well known as...
One moment, Uli.
Er hat jetzt noch vergessen zu sagen, dass die Veranstaltung gefilmt wird und auf die Seite der Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung gestellt wird. Wer also damit nicht einverstanden ist, der müsste dann, wenn es ins Publikum mal geht, bei Fragestellungen tatsächlich den Raum verlassen oder sich eine Ecke suchen, wo ich mit der Kamera nicht hinkomme.
Ja, gibt es denn Leute, die grundsätzlich das Problem damit haben, dass ihr Gesicht auf einem Film auftaucht? Weil das müssten wir dann vielleicht jetzt auch klären, dann wird das nachher ein bisschen einfacher.
Sieht sich doch.
Ja, und wir haben Masken. Okay. Ja, danke Uli, dass du darauf hingewiesen hast. Okay, sorry.
Okay, no problem. Well, Paul is working as a journalist since decades, and he's working as a political activist in Great Britain. And you may know some books of him, which are printed in Germany. You may know Postkapitalismus, for example, and you may know Klare Lichte Zukunft about Humanismus, which was printed in 2019. And this evening we will speak about his new work, Faschismus und wie man ihn stoppt. As we first planned this evening, we could not imagine what would happen on the 24th of February. Russia attacks, well, the Ukraine, and this war changes everything in politics and changes many things in the cultural way. We will talk about this. Paul, can you remember what you felt, what your thoughts were on this day?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you for inviting me. It's always great to be in a space owned by the workers' movement. I have been, this is my 9th day on tour, and I spent 7 days in Austria and the last 2 days here. And it's a great place to end it because unser Fahrt bleibt rot here. So I will answer your question. I flew to Kiev on the 19th of February with a delegation of trade unionists and left Labour representatives from one of our regional parliaments in Wales. And the reason we went was that our government had monopolised the relationship between British people and the Ukrainian people. We had our ministers going backwards and forwards. We had long planned this trip, but we were told by our own government to cancel it because for safety reasons. But we went anyway. And I'm so glad that we went. We met human rights defenders, we met the small social democratic and radical left groups, and we met the unions, the trade unions. And on the morning after, you remember on the 21st of February, Putin declared that he was going to annex effectively the Donbass. On the morning after this, we were lucky enough to be invited to a trade union headquarters. Not so great as this, but it was definitely felt like a trade union headquarters. The workers there had seen their conditions attacked by Zelensky. Yeah, they had seen his party and other parties try to privatise the railways and take the union headquarters away from the union. These were veterans, these were miners and railway workers. And in a room pretty full of them, about the same number. Everyone was shocked at this announcement that they would take the Donbass. But they told us very simply, despite their differences, despite their class struggle against the Zelensky government, they said this: when Putin took when the Donbass separatists took the two breakaway republics, they said our union was immediately banned, our activists were kidnapped, tortured, and in 2 cases killed. So we can't exist as a workers' movement under Russian conditions. Here, we, of course, fight back against the government. But they just said, this time we won't run away. This time the words were, we are going home to get our guns. And they were just ordinary workers like ourselves. My reaction when the next day, we left, of course, we knew the war was about to start. We left that night because then the orders from the government came. We must immediately leave. When I woke up 18 hours later to hear Putin had invaded, I knew, despite all the complications of war and all the injustices that exist on both sides, and the existence of the far right on both sides, that for those workers, this war was just. And I didn't have to think anymore about what to do.
You wrote a very personal statement a few days ago in the newspaper Frankfurter Rundschau. You wrote, who wants to live free must take the risk to defend freedom. So this is a statement which is very important for the German discussion, because we have a very heavy discussion about should we intervene with weapons, should we help with weapons, or we have also, I had a discussion 2 days ago, we have the pacifistic way, which means no weapons, no military aid at all. So, your position is clear.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say that to religious pacifists and ethical pacifists, I have no objection. We had very brave pacifists in the First World War in Britain who literally were shot. But the consistent pacifist position is not the same as the one that I've heard from sections of the far left in Britain, in America, and here. Because that position is, let's deal with that. It says the whole war was caused by NATO aggression against Russia. Okay? And I just don't think there is evidence for that. As a journalist, I have good sources inside the governments and the security apparatus of Britain and other countries. And actually, in the run-up to the war, the position of Biden was not so different to the position of Scholz and Macron. Actually, the rhetoric may have been different, the way it was expressed. But so, first of all, this position I don't think is tenable. I think, of course, there is another position that says, be careful about where the weapons go. There is a position that says, we have, in Germany, a strong, not neutrality, because you have been a NATO member, but you have a position of not deploying, not sending arms into conflict situations. I understand that, and so what I was trying to do in the article was to bring those who fear this to the next stage, because I appreciate Chancellor Scholz. I can see him wrestling in his mind with a real problem. And let's be clear, it's what it is. It is the problem that the employers, who many of you as trade unionists deal with, are pressuring him on the gas. It's not. I don't believe it's the nuclear threat. It's the problem that gas is a existential, like almost a semi-nuclear issue for Germany. Nobody wants to see elderly people freezing in their homes. I think Scholz understands that this is a risk, and that's what I was trying to do, to address that argument. Because I am in favour of the arms, I'm in favour of aid, I'm in favour of the sanctions, and another important thing is the Ukrainian left demand cancelling the debt.
Yeah. But there is a fear amongst the people in Germany. You could feel it. That's well, it could be the beginning of a world war. Third, yes. And if you see what the people say in these public discussions, there is well, it's about half of them. Yeah, they have this fear that we could get into a World War III and we cannot stop it.
The threat of World War III has been there ever since World War II, in the sense, ever since we got mutually assured destruction weapons. Even the person I was having the argument with, the eminent and highly respected by me, Jürgen Habermas, was saying, actually, he says in his Süddeutsche Zeitung article, of course, we cannot say, he said this, we cannot exchange the safety from nuclear war for absolute servitude, for lives that cannot be lived freely. Because, and I think he's correct here, because the lives of many Russian people are, and even worse, Chinese people, every year the schools turn out people who have been taught not to think, not to resist, not to question. Soon in Putin's Russia it will be the same. And so I think all I'm arguing with Scholz and with Habermas is that yes, there is a threat, that something we do will trigger this guy to do something irrational, but when we are facing the other existential threat, which is that he conquers 40 million people, we've seen the levels of criminal violence against them, rape, torture, execution, and then the next people will be in the Estonians, and then the next people after that the Moldovans. In the end, my ancestors, it was a different problem for your ancestors, for your grandparents. In the end, my grandparents had to decide who wants a world war. We've seen it, it's awful. But are we going to at some point say no and mobilise our, not for a direct confrontation, but for in doing what we fortunately can do, which is to support our Ukrainian brothers and sisters in resisting. That's, for me, seems to me the just and correct thing to do.
But you wrote too that you see some parallel developments between the month before 1940, the August of 1940, the last month before World War I, and the time now.
Yes, I think there are. There is a kind of orthodox Marxist Luxembourgist, Liebknechtist position that says this war is a war for influence between the US imperialism, there is European imperialism, I think there is German imperialism, there is certainly British imperialism. And it was brought home when I visited Kiev. The railway workers told us, when the employers come to negotiate with them, they say, okay, Zelensky's party wants to join the European Union. And they say, in the European Union, there are no trade unions. There are no trade unions. There are no negotiations. You don't have a beautiful headquarters for a trade union. We need that in order that we can live like the West. Now, they said this in a room. One of Zelensky's, we confronted one of Zelensky's ministers, and I had with me the General Secretary, the national leader of the British railway workers, and the national leader of the British mining workers. And they just said to him, I'm sorry, the European Union does not work like that. Now, I think it's important when we rebuild Ukraine that the KGB, the SPD, and IG Metall place massive pressure on Zelensky's administration. If you're going to be in Europe, you must be like Europe. But for me to finish, here's the other story. When Macron went to meet Zelensky just before the war, he came home with a €3 billion privatization contract for Alstom. So my comrades, who are now in uniform fighting, they are not giving their lives for Alstom. They are giving it for the freedom to be Western, to be Ukrainian, to be democratic. And so I think that the inter-imperialist rivalries are there, but for me, the systemic character of the war, a fight for democratic freedom and national self-determination against someone, I mean, I've written my book before this, someone who increasingly looks like at very least a violent totalitarian ethno-nationalist, also known as fascist. That overrides the problem of inter-imperialist conflict for me. But I can perfectly understand that for some it doesn't.
In preparing this evening, I saw a video again. It's from the 25th of September of 2001. And Vladimir Putin spoke in the Deutsche Bundestag. And he spoke in German. And he invited the Germans and he invited the European Union to work together with Russia. And he said he will guarantee democratic rights and freedom in Russia. And he said he wanted to build a new order of security in Europe together with the other European states. So this was on the 25th of 2001. The attacks on New York just were 2 weeks ago. When we look now back to this day, what do you think? What are the reasons of the development in those 21 years? We have spoken about the development of NATO, a kind of expansion of NATO to the east. This was one reason, I think, or?
Okay, the first thing we need to remember that even as Putin made that speech 1 year before, he had personally altered Russia's nuclear doctrine to allow for tactical nuclear weapons. First. The reason he did that was in response to the US intervention and the NATO intervention into Kosovo. So if we're tracing cause and effect, we need to go back a little bit further. And why did NATO intervene into Kosovo? Because there was a danger of ethnic mass murder. I don't. My attitude towards that intervention is neutral. I'm not so keen. In the end, it did save some lives. It also upset the balance. But for me, the real moment when both Russia and China begin to massively arm themselves is the invasion of Iraq, because I think they armed themselves in response to the fact that America was not just invading Iraq. If you remember, those of us who were active then, America had a doctrine of that was called in English the unipolar world, a single world power focused by America, and Thomas Friedman, the neoliberal journalist, summed this up as the iron fist of McDonnell Douglas in the velvet glove of McDonald's. He was averred that this was economic power and military power. Okay, who can blame China and Russia for rearming? Okay. However, something has happened to the Putin regime. It has radicalized beyond, I argue, beyond the logical reaction to the threat. It has become, at the very least, an ethno-nationalist project, a project of 50 years of retaking Eastern Europe. And when our friends on the far left say NATO advanced, well, this was a series of democratic decisions by our colleagues in Poland and Estonia. And here's the other thing. I do think it is unwise for NATO to have what is called the open door policy without conditions. I have written a proposal that I want left parties to take to NATO in Madrid at the end of June, which says, okay, open door to countries which respect democratic rights, are not at war, do not have a territorial claim, can demonstrate responsibility. I think that NATO did make mistakes in the run-up to this war because it kept saying the door is open, not only to Ukraine but to Georgia. And if you look at a map where Georgia is, if you're going to say that, then you must be, at the same time, if something bad happens in response, like a massive invasion and a terrible war, then you have to be able to look behind you to your 30 allies and say, okay, did everybody expect this? And no, the populations of our countries did not expect this. So I think there was a failure of diplomacy by NATO.
But if we look at the character of this Russian attack, it's not only a military attack, it's, for me, it's a cultural attack too. The Russians are destroying cultural institutions like museums. They steal artwork from museums, bring them to Russia. It's for me, it's a kind of destroying of the Ukrainian culture, isn't it?
We shouldn't be surprised. For people like me who have followed the development of Putin and the far-right influence around him, the open question in my mind, until the day the war started, is this. There is the ethno-nationalist Putin, who wrote the essay in July last year on the historical relationship between the Russians and Ukrainians, claiming that Ukrainians are really Russians, and there can be no Ukraine. Okay, this is a crazed reading of history. It's the work of a man influenced by the Russian fascist philosopher Alexander Dugin. Dugin believes that the whole of Eurasia, so from Vladivostok to here, should be run as a single state by white European nationalism, and that there should be no non-white ethnic minorities in it. This is fascism. But at the same time, Putin's treaties, his demands on Eastern Europe to demilitarize, were, if wrong, you could say at least they existed in the tradition of diplomacy. You know, it's a kind of Metternician move. And I had this in my mind, is this guy simply trying to gain a new security relationship with Europe to his advantage, which I don't favour, but I can see why? Or is he mad enough to think that he could turn 40 million Ukrainians into unwilling Russians? And on 24th of February, the answer was given, because it's not just a cultural attack. This is all the distasteful things: rape, torture, forced relocation of 1.5 million people, the removal of children from their homes, and yes, the destruction of cultural artifacts. I think that what's shocking is not just that it's a war, but it's that kind of war again. And I think we should all learn to expect the worst from this guy.
Would you say that this political system in Russia is a fascist system up to now, or it's the character of the fascist system?
Right. I wrote my book because I was worried about the sudden salience of fascist ideology in the West. And so my book is an argument with the traditional academic industry which studies fascism, that tries to say you need to move faster, you need to have a more rich and materialist understanding of why this fascist ideology, which I think we'll talk about, why it is spreading so fast in our countries, in the West, among young men. That was the problem I was looking at in the book. In the process, I did a critique of what we call totalitarianism theory. The theory that totalitarianism was a form of government unique to the 20th century. Okay? I'm very shocked at the rapidity with which Putin's authoritarian regime has become actually totalitarian. No free press, no free thought. The population mobilised like in Orwell's 1984 to inform on their neighbours. The question of whether it's fascist doesn't matter. Unusually, there are fascist movements in Russia, but Putin doesn't need them because he came to power through the military and the oligarchic elite. I think it is behaving, if you want to say, at the same level as Mussolini's Italy, but not yet at the same level of fascism as Nazi Germany, because although I think there is genocidal rhetoric and there is genocidal action, the Bucha massacre was, genocide needs intent plus action under the Nuremberg laws. And I can find intent and action in the Bucha massacre, but he is not yet on a mass scale perpetrating the kind of unique crime that we saw in the show. But we've only just started. And this is the horrible thing we have to tell our children and our grandchildren. He's only just started. It could get worse.
But it's a kind of bitter irony that Putin claims to fight fascism.
Yeah.
He claims to fight fascism in the Ukraine. And you can now see that he prepares a kind of trial against against the Azov Brigade, the defenders of Mariupol. And I think you can say that he will have a big political show on this Azov Brigade.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We are unfortunately reaping the bitter rewards of not just militarizing, but turning Western society into a war machine. One of my friends went to Raqqa in Syria, which when it was just on the edge of the control by the Daesh, the ISIS. Yeah? And she interviewed some people who had been just ordinary Muslims and were now quite happy with ISIS. And this is what they said: the world only takes you seriously if you kill millions of people. You know that the Daesh are obsessed with Adolf Hitler. They say the world took him seriously and remembered him because he killed millions of people. We are going to kill millions of people. And I think in a way, all the big dictators of our modern time fantasize about mass death. And I think that there will be a show trial. Let's remember, 1.5 million people have been deported. Some of them to Vladivostok, some of them to Sakhalin. You know, I mean, literally, these are really extreme things. But I think he does them to command attention. Because the whole purpose of this war, for me, is not about Ukraine. It's about forcing Joe Biden, or the American president, to deal direct with Putin. Leave NATO, sideline the European Union, forget international law. It's two powerful men who will divide up Europe, divide up the world, and Xi Jinping will join them in Southeast Asia. And maybe Narendra Modi of India will be allowed into the conversation. He wants a new great power politics. And that's why he's been doing these big, horrific, demonstrative things. Just like my friend who interviewed the Daesh members, Daesh periphery, he knows that throughout the world, poor and uneducated people only respect you if you have killed a lot of people. And what a world is that to be living in?
Let's speak about this fascist character as you describe it in your book. You wrote about the system of Bolsonaro in Brazil. You wrote about the system of Modi in India. You also write about the AfD. In Germany, what are the parallels between those groups and systems?
The thesis of the book is that we spent 20 years creating three categories. Conservatism, right-wing conservatism, like Dobrindt. Conservatism, right-wing populism, and fascism. Right-wing populism in this country would be the mainstream AfD. Fascism would be Nordkreuz, the prepper, the military. The problem of our time is that academics assume, and many politicians assume, that the ones in the middle, the right-wing populists, would be like a firewall, a barrier against real fascism. So the people who are really angry about immigrants and don't like feminists would spend their time mobilised around groups like the AfD or Front National, Rassemblement National in France, or UKIP in my country. And distasteful though they were not fascist, and that's right. The problem is, as I say in the book, the firewall is on fire. Right-wing populism has become the echo chamber of fascism. Trump became the echo chamber of the actual fascists he mobilised. And so, what we are dealing with is a primarily ideological colonisation of all right-wing thought by the key propositions of fascism, the number one of which is the so-called Great Replacement theory.
We make some proposals how we can defend and how we can get back to an offensive tactic against fascism and neo-fascism. One of your proposals is that the left and the liberals in your society must work together. Could you explain this in a historical way?
Yeah, when we get to this moment, everyone really gets angry. Because the left don't want to work with centrists and the centrists don't want to work with left people. And I understand why. Hannah Arendt said fascism is the temporary alliance of the elite and the mob. In Arendt's time, there were only two successful examples of stopping fascism, and even they didn't last long. They were the victory of the Spanish Popular Front in the February 1936 election. They won by 100,000 votes out of 9 million, so it was close. The whole right had united from fascist to conservative in one bloc, and so the whole of the Republicans which was like liberalism, republicanism, communism and socialism, and in Spain, progressive nationalism, like in Catalonia and Galicia, had to unite in a single electoral bloc. Did they like each other? No. Did they trust each other? No. So that's the first example. The second is better known, which is the Front Populaire in France. In July the same year. Same problem. Fascism on the march, militaristic gangs, the democracy faltering, falling, major institutions seeming no longer to work. And again, this was the policy by now of the Communist International to promote an electoral alliance of socialists, communists and liberals. When they won, it had a secondary effect. It triggered the biggest mass strike in history. That was a positive effect. The negative effect, within 6 to 9 months, was that the liberals started to back away because they had unleashed a much more radical thing than they thought. The even better positive effect, which I am still arguing is the greatest thing, is it created a cultural movement against fascism in France that was bigger than the sum of its parts. And I think that is what we need to emulate, but only where there is the real threat of a far-right, populist-like, conservative advance to government. Because, to finish here, we know from my own government today, which is technically a conservative government, they're in the middle of a scandal. What they do when they're in power, and Viktor Orban is the best example, they remove all possibility of democratically removing them. So the stakes are high. Once they're in power, you will see it again in 2024 in America. Their whole objective is to remain in power forever. And then the state will decay, the democracy will decay, and the fascist opportunity will rise. So that's why I argue for a modern version of the popular vote.
In your book you quote a famous movie, which many of you may know. This is Casablanca, which was done in the year 1942. And you say in the book, everybody has to become guest in Rick's Cafe. We remember Rick's Cafe in this movie, and the people in Rick's Cafe have to decide on which side they are on. Are they on the side of resistance? Are they on the side of the Nazis? This is what we have to decide on in the practice, isn't it?
Casablanca is such a powerful anti-fascist movie that when I showed it to some young playwrights and actors who had never seen it and said, what would the modern version of Casablanca be? They said, oh no, we couldn't produce propaganda. We couldn't produce something like this. What I argue for in the book is that the more important than any tactics is the emergence of an anti-fascist ethos, a code of moral conduct. If you think about the heroic resistance, including in this city, against Nazism, against Mussolini, against the occupation in the Second World War, yes, some were driven by a belief in communism or a desire to see a return democratic Germany. But I think it wouldn't have mobilised so many people so spontaneously had there not been something deeper. And Casablanca, for me, is valuable because all moral codes need stories. If you're a Christian, the stories are about saints and of course Jesus Christ. But for a secular progressive movement, the movie just asked that question. He has already fought fascism. Humphrey Bogart. He was in the Spanish Civil War, that's the plot. He's been in the Spanish Civil War, he's fought Mussolini in Ethiopia. He's failed. He's drinking too much. He can have any woman in the bar he wants, but he chooses to fight fascism again. Even though, and the symbolism is clear, French capitalism, in the shape of the French police chief, who's corrupt, gambling, womanizing. French capitalism is corrupt too. And so it's only for the values of what's life? I think he asked himself, what is life worth if we don't fight? So it could be moving moment. We must remember that film was not made accidentally. Only 4 of the cast were American citizens. Almost everybody else in the movie were anti-fascist refugees from Europe. And on the set, if you read the history of the movie, on the set there was a communist writer as well, Howard Koch. The arguments were going on daily between we need to make a funny movie that makes fun of Nazis so that Americans don't feel them. And the refugees, one was a famous anti-fascist from Austria, other famous Jewish actors from France, said no, we need to make a moral story. And I think that's why I use it as a teaching aid for young people for the moment we must go through. And of course there will be in this room many comrades who have already fought fascism, don't need to be taught how to do it. But it's so easy for the Instagram generation to say, yeah, it's bad, but I don't need to do anything. We do need to do something.
And you remarked in your book that we all of us, in the daily life, that we fight against symbols of fascism. And you quote some persons. You quote Carl Schmitt, for example. You quote Nietzsche, for example. And you demand in your book that we all go into a discussion about these persons in the daily practice, in the daily life.
Well, Carl Schmitt was a Nazi. Carl Schmitt arranged personally to remove all Jewish books from the Berlin Library of Law. And yet it stuns me that because he rehabilitated himself after the war, we now have liberal and left academics who say, yes, but his ideas were interesting. Well, they are interesting, but we must understand what the core of them are. It's almost exactly the same as Putin and Dugin, which is society must not be heterogeneous. Societies which have difference are weak. Only societies which are homogeneous are strong. And that's not just about race, it's also about ideas. So Schmitt, in a way, what he tried to do was to regularize Nazism. Because those of you who have studied the Third Reich will know that, in fact, it was a chaotic regime. It had, yes, there were orders from the top, but every time the orders went wrong, they responded with a new agency. So you have the Todt agency, then you have other agencies set up. And before you know it, you have a Byzantine structure where many people are doing their own thing. Okay. Schmitt said, what we need is legality. We need almost like a Nazi constitution that regularizes this so that there is the rule of law. Even the Shoah, even the Holocaust. In the book I write about Operation Reinhardt, which was commanded by Heydrich, but also executed by this guy, Austrian guy, Globochnik, Odilo Globochnik. SS. Well, he ran the 4 main death camps in Soviet Poland. Even he could not bring himself to say what he was going to do. He said, in a few weeks we will be sending the Jews across the Bug River. He didn't even see them as human. Arendt points out that men like that didn't even see themselves as human. They didn't care whether they lived or died. But Schmitt wanted to create something bigger. He wanted to create an intellectual order for this stuff. No, he failed. Hitler said, we don't need a thorough theorized fascism. Mein Kampf is enough. What we see today in the works of the the philosophers of modern fascism, Dugin, Carvalho in Brazil, de Benoit in France, is almost like a re-theorization of fascism. And we must learn about it because it's in our 17-year-olds, young men who are playing games and talking while they play on these voice servers. When you listen in, and when the anti-fascist infiltrators listen in, it's the ideas of Schmidt, Dugin, Carvalho, Julius Evola, the fascist philosopher, are all there. And we sit there thinking, yeah, but they're like, it's naive. It's not naive. They have a very thoroughly worked out idea, and this time they intend to do it right. That's the scary thing.
Well, Paul, thank you very much. Up to this point, yeah, it's getting hotter and hotter. So, I think we should get the public the opportunity to take some questions or remarks. If there are some questions or remarks, this will be the opportunity now. Please. We have a micro, Alexa.
Yes, we have a microphone.
Yeah, go on. Please. Any questions, remarks?
Darf ich auf Deutsch sprechen und kann jemand übersetzen? Mein English is not so good that I would prefer to speak German if possible. Yeah. Ich habe verstanden, dass mit dem Faschismus, aber ich würde gerne noch mal fragen, sehen Sie Faschismus nur ganz rechts? Ich bin Französin und ich habe das Dilemma, teilweise, ich muss mich entscheiden zwischen Mélenchon, Le Pen oder Macron, grob gesagt. Ne? Mélenchon ist für mich ganz weit links und ist auch ein Freund von Putin. Madame Le Pen ist nicht besser. Für mich, Faschismus wird immer gesehen als etwas, was ganz rechts ist, aber für mich ist, was ganz links ist, genauso schlimm. Was meinen Sie dazu?
Okay. I am not a big fan of Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Okay. To me, he represents an old form of leftism that willfully disregards evidence about Putin, willfully misinterprets what is going on, and he has made peace with a kind of soft French patriotism. So they don't sing the Internationale anymore, they will only sing the Marseillaise. Incidentally, that's what the Communist Party did in 1936 when they joined the Popular Front, so there's a long history. I would vote for the alliance of socialist parties that he now represents in this election, and would in the last, if given the chance, simply because I do not see him as equivalent to the far right. And I think we need to be, well, in the book I've tried to, I don't want to give definitions of fascism because I just think they're futile, they're not explanations. But one statement I would make about what modern fascism is, and the old fascism, it's the fear of freedom mobilized by seeing people attempt to gain freedom. This word, this sentence, comes from the work of Wilhelm Reich. So I don't think fascism is just about unemployment or racism. It's a fear of freedom. And what you can see very clearly in the extreme right, Zemmour, is all the features of fascism. Great replacement, anti-feminism, attack on cultural Marxism, racism, yes, and also this idea that there is a great day coming when modernity will end. That's there in Zemmour. It's there I think, subcutaneously with Marine Le Pen. But when I meet the activists of the Mélenchon movement, none of that is there. We are seeing people who I think are misled, who've been misled because the internationalist left, both the Socialist Party and the far left, failed in France, and Mélenchon picked up the pieces. So I don't subscribe to the so-called horseshoe theory that says the far left and the far right are the same. Remember, but as you clap, remember that the three arrows of Austrian social democracy embody that theory. The three arrows are aimed at the communists, the fascists, and the Christian Democrats. But okay, so however, this war in Russia has made me really concerned about the behaviour and obsessions of some on not Mélenchon, but some on the extreme left. Because you've read your own history. You will know that the KPD held joint demonstrations with the fascists in the Brandenburg and Prussian election. We know about the Red-Brown railway strike in 1932. To me, terrible though these events were in the history of the KPD, they were ones that the membership didn't like, they felt bad about it. That was not the essence of the KPD. The essence of the KPD was ultra-leftist, class against class, refusal to unite with the SPD. That was their problem. Today, I meet leftists who are obsessed with supporting Putin, obsessed with proving that the Bucha massacre didn't exist, obsessed with proving that Zelensky invaded Donbass on the 16th of February. And I do worry about that, because they are exhibiting now a psychological tendency that you do see on the far right, which is to live in a fact-free world. And so, I don't call them fascists, but I am, you may know, and we may find out in this meeting, that I am at war with them in the British Labour movement, determined that my Ukrainian comrades will know we supported you, and these people were not supported.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah.
Moment, die Wahlmeldung vor Ihnen, danach.
Ja, mein Name ist Paul Heinemann. Der spanische und der italienische Faschismus hat sich mit dem deutschen Faschismus ja grundsätzlich unterschieden. Vor 80 Jahren, am 20. Januar 1942, wurde ja mit der Wannsee-Konferenz die Vernichtung des Judentums in Europa beschlossen. Und die anderen Länder haben alle auch mitgemacht, denn sonst wäre es überhaupt nicht möglich gewesen, die Juden zu vernichten. Im Jahr 2007 haben wir hier in Frankfurt erlebt, die neuen Nazis, die neuen Faschisten haben proklamiert, das Jerusalem am Main in die nationale Gemeinschaft zurückzuführen. Da deckt sich wieder der gleiche Geist, der von Deutschland ausgeht, in faschistischer Ideologie. Und wie kann man das eigentlich real bekämpfen? Es sieht so aus, als würde es heute nicht immer nur gegen Juden gehen, aber im Endeffekt ist ja immer wieder klar, und so weiter, die Juden sind schuld, ob die Sonne scheint, ob es regnet oder was auch immer passiert.
So I think they got it summarized.
Yeah. He said, how can we in practice fight the new fascism?
Okay.
And the point is that the Jews are the new and the old enemy.
Yes. Thank you for that comment. I think we have to, where they are small and extreme, then the old methods work, which is we mobilise young people. We're all wearing these masks today for COVID. We could wear masks for a different reason, and in short order, throw them off the streets. The problem is that the streets are not where they're operating, primarily. They're operating online, through networks, and it's not just like that the network replicates the old hierarchical Nazism. It's very different. My friends who infiltrate say they operate like a shoal of fish. Like all they have to do is spontaneously move to a new target or a new obsession. And while you're monitoring them here, they've gone over here. At the moment, the violence they want to perpetrate is symbolic. In the book, I give some examples of how modern fascism uses violence symbolically. So the Austrian fascist Martin Sellner, of Generation Identity, went to the Greek-Turkish border to give leaflets to migrants saying go home. Jimmy Akerson, the leader of the Sweden Democrats, went with him. He is another far right. While they were giving the leaflets, the local fascists, the Greek fascists, took guns and rounded up the migrants, took their shoes away, and arrested them illegally until the police came. So what was the purpose of this? The purpose wasn't just to catch 20 migrants. It was to say, one day, when the European ethnic civil war begins, this will be the battlefield. The Evros River, Turkish-Greek border. Today, 2 of us came. Then, millions will go. This is how they work. So how do we disrupt that? Germany has laws better than any other country. We must implement them. You can't rely on the state, but we must use such laws that exist, especially online. I think the European Union's new law against online hate and algorithmic promotion of hate must be used to the maximum. And then it's anti-fascist education. It's going to young people and saying, you will hear online about the Great Replacement Theory, cultural Marxism, violent misogynist theories. It's all wrong. And as you try with your children, you'll find out they already know about it. They have already heard it. White genocide. You need to get in early to do the anti-fascist education. I would put on every wall in every school arguments against fascism.
One important point answering the question, what can we do in practice? In your book you write, we need a new cultural mass movement. What does this mean?
I was lucky enough. The first demonstration I went on was an anti-fascist demonstration, and I was 17. And it was something we called Rock Against Racism in 1977. It had beautiful iconography, some of the greatest design I've ever seen, with this arrow, if you've ever seen it. We had a thing called Anti-Nazi League. Now, when we went on this, it was simply a peaceful demonstration. But the end was a concert. And as we marched through the poor areas of Manchester where this took place, everybody came out and joined us. Even people who didn't like punk rock, not everybody likes it. And they joined. And by the end of it, the whole park was full of probably 70,000 people. That's what Antonio Gramsci called hegemony. We at that point represented the whole of society in that city. That must be our ambition. But of course today, in a city like Frankfurt, much more diverse communities. There is no overwhelming single cultural statement we can make. But I think I've seen it done like this. In the Catalan referendum, which I attended, the illegal Catalan referendum of October 2018. Yeah. The Catalans were fighting for an independence. The Spanish far right was against them, of course the Spanish state as well. Whatever you think about Catalan independence, this is what they did. They produced a cultural concert which had all aspects of Catalan life, so the traditional costumes, and then the modern football, this Barcelona FC. And then they brought on Syrian refugees, dressed in their own clothes. And the message was, the Syrian refugees are part of Catalan culture. It's part, they created a kind of new version of their culture. And I think that's just one example of what we can do. It's about creating a cultural statement that is positive and is looking to the future and that includes people, but it's also militantly democratic. It's not just to say, we're frightened of these people, please go away. It's, look how beautiful life can be if we all together reject the fascist values. And I think we should ask our artists, our singers, our playwrights to be producing anti-fascist work in the same way as in the 1930s, because they produced their best work in the anti-fascist movement. So that's my answer to that.
Okay, any other questions? Yeah. Okay.
Guten Tag, mein Name ist Günter Hümann. Ich habe zwei Fragen. Könnte diese Krise nicht die Krise des kapitalistischen Weltsystems reflektieren, die wir gerade erleben? Denn Russland ist ja auch Teil des kapitalistischen Weltsystems, ja, aber das schwächste Glied. Und das schwächste Glied ist am größten gefährdet. Die zweite Frage, haben wir nicht eine ähnliche Situation wie 1929, eine tiefe Krise des kapitalistischen Systems, was damals zum Faschismus geführt hat letztendlich? Und die dritte Frage, hat der Kapitalismus als Lösung den Faschismus immer im Hintergrund? Also könnten wir auch in Westeuropa ein neues faschistisches System entstehen lassen?
Okay. I actually understand everything except the second one.
The second one is there a similar situation to 1929? Yeah.
Okay.
4 years before.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I think I will answer generally that what has caused the rise of the new extreme right ideology is not something like the mass unemployment we saw after 1929. It's the ideological collapse of neoliberal thinking. So in 2008, the neoliberal system blew up. Since then, the central banks, money printed by the central banks, plus debt, has kept capitalism alive. You can keep capitalism alive on life support for a long time, but you can't keep an ideology alive because it becomes inconsistent and incoherent. No, there are people my age in this room. You remember the 1960s and 70s, when we called it the Keynesian era, the era when Keynesian economics ruled, guided governments. Keynesianism was an economic theory, but it wasn't a theory of everything. Neoliberalism was a theory of everything. It explained not only how the economy worked, how human behaviour takes place, it's even used in prisons to reward or punish prisoners. When the theory of everything explodes, this is what Karl Mannheim teaches while I'm studying the 1920s here. He said, when a passive, generally accepted ideology explodes, people look for a new theory of everything. But now they want a theory that fits the crisis. This is why I don't root the emergence of far-right extremism primarily in an economic crisis. It's a crisis of belief in neoliberalism among human beings who've really internalized the neoliberal values of atomization, individualism. Me, I am the number one person in the world. So that's the answer to the general answer. I would say, with regard to does capitalism need fascism right now? No. But I would also argue that Weimar capitalism did not need Nazism. In fact, we know this because Alfred Hugenberg and the other right-wing, the leaders of Siemens, Krupp and the rest, even Kurt Schleicher, is trying to the very end to work out a conclusion. How can we have an authoritarian Germany, autarkic in its economy, re-armed, re-industrialised, and get some colonies in Eastern Europe? That was it. But actually the answer was not with a democracy. And that's then. Now, what's the problem? Capitalism doesn't see a future. It can't explain to the ordinary person out there in the kebab shop in Frankfurt how life is going to get better for their children. What it wants is what it cannot have, which is high productivity, high growth, high skill, high wages. It can't deliver these things, and in my country, it really cannot deliver them. So, but right now, it doesn't need fascism. But certain factions of the elite, the nationalist factions behind Trump, behind behind Le Pen, those factions know that they need a street army. They need emotional, connected to the working class and the lower fractions of society, because they are rich. You know, the elite people like Trump. He's a rich guy. How does he connect to the American working class? He needs the Proud Boys going around saying and hating women. He needs the Oath Keepers militia with their guns. And he mobilised them on January the 6th. So I think that's the current relationship. But again, it can change. We will see bigger crises. And that's the lesson. We just have to understand what's driving people towards it. And one of our key demands must be on conservative parties to distance themselves completely from fascism and from the fascist agenda. I'm sorry to say, my own government will not. They will use great replacement rhetoric. What else are they doing when they threaten to sink the boats of the migrants or send them to Rwanda? You know, this is fascist ideology, even for conservatives.
Okay. Da war noch eine Frage, ja.
Also mich würde besonders interessieren, ein bisschen mehr über den brasilianischen Faschismus zu hören. Ich bin Brasilianerin und meine Frage ist, bald haben wir Wahl und wie kann man das überhaupt erklären, wie kann man das erläutern, dass unter so einer großen Arbeitslosigkeit und unter so schlechten Bedingungen, wie jetzt Brasilien lebt, dass immer noch so viele Leute dabei sind, ihn zu wählen, wieder. Und noch dazu, wie kann man das überhaupt bekämpfen? Also wie kann man...
Yeah, it's about Bolsonaro and the election in Brazil in a few months, and she asked about some facts about the Brazilian fascism, and how could we explain today that so many people still support Bolsonaro?
Okay, great question. For me, this is how it works and what I describe in the book. You've got Bolsonaro, who is he's a right-wing populist, but he's close to fascism. Then you've got the Brazilian elite bourgeoisie. Look who rushed to congratulate him when he came to power. All the guys in the beautiful white shirts in the financial district, guys who would meet in Frankfurt and think they were liberals. But why? Because, you know, if I say it's fear of freedom, what does Lula represent to the Brazilian masses other than freedom? And Lula is not far left, he is simply, right now I would say, he's become more and more of a social democrat. And then you have the fascists. Okay, they come in two forms. In the book I describe this incident with the so-called 300 Brazilians, led by a classic person who gets caught up in fascism called Sarah Winter. She's a young woman, ex-sex worker, was in Femina, she was vaguely left. She becomes this kind of overt fascist. tries to march on the Supreme Court with arms, with guns, with the skull masks. But that's not really the problem. The problem is the ideological networks of far-right thinkers, which are squatted on the evangelical Christian networks, just as in America. And then you've got Olavo de Carvalho, who's one of the key fascist philosophers of our time, died this year. Do not say rest in peace to him. And Carvalho is pumping out this ideology which I'm describing. What's the biggest problem for ordinary left activists or workers or trade unionists in Brazil? It's this. It's not Sarah Winter and her fascist group. It's that a teacher standing in a classroom in 2018 teaching the biology lesson they have taught forever. Suddenly, a child at the back stands up and says, enough with this Marxism. We'll get out of the... I'm not tolerating any more Marxism. The teacher's going, what the hell's happened? Where did this come from? And you find where it came from is YouTube. Because YouTube mobilized and weaponized all the far-right ideologies against biological science, against feminism, against vaccinations, actually way before COVID. And who's the biggest disseminator of fascism in Brazil is YouTube. So this problem of algorithmic promotion, combined with the fact that you've got a philosophical, powerful philosophical figure, a powerful political figure, Bolsonaro, prepared to use the militarist networks, riding on horseback, quoting the generals, speaking constantly about military coups. And then, yes, you've got a fascist militia who don't really matter. So, but we have an answer. I mean, the answer is democracy. Number one, a Supreme Court that stands up for its rights, which it did, in a Parliament which stood up against Bolsonaro, and a powerful Parliament, and Lula is out of jail and will stand. And I think the whole international labour movement, though maybe Lula and me won't agree exactly on Ukraine, whole international labour movement will have to stand behind the Brazilian left in this coming election.
Okay. Yeah.
It's a good discussion.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yeah. So, hi Paul. First and foremost, thank you very much for the talk, and it's great to have you here. And I think you're one of the most important voices on the left. And also, in general, although we haven't talked about this today, I like very much that you defend Marx as an Enlightenment thinker. I think this is very important and great. So I have two questions. The first is on our coping with the past. I was very struck by the fact that I read a poll a couple of days ago across the European Union, where the country which was most in favor of Ukraine's accession to the EU was in fact Portugal. So I was really struck by that. And then I read another poll which was about continuing diplomatic ties with Russia. And Italy and Germany were, I mean, half of the population is in favor of that. Whereas in Spain, for instance, it's very low, that number. And Italy, Germany, Spain, and Portugal have something in common. They have a dictatorial experience in the 20th century. And Portugal has had, I think, the longest dictatorship in the 20th century. So my first question is, do you think there's something that Germany and Italy can learn from Portugal and Spain? Have they perhaps coped better with their past? Because in Germany, we always say, we're the best at that, right? We have coped with the past, we tell everybody else how the Holocaust went, and so on and so forth. And the second question is about something different but related. You talked about Nietzsche, Heidegger, and Schmidt, and I was wondering, because at the university I'm studying at, there are also a lot of people on the left who are really in favor of Nietzsche and Heidegger. They say, oh, we can really use Nietzsche and Heidegger to appropriate Nietzsche and Heidegger to start a left-wing project, and Laclau and Wolfgang, and they've done that, and Foucault and all the others. And I'm always saying to them, I mean, we need to defend facts, we need to defend science. And I like it that you're doing that as well, but I'm lost, like, what do I say to my fellow students, how to start a left-wing project that is evidence-based and in favor of emancipation?
You have put your finger in that last point on the exact debate that should be at the centre of the modern left.
Die im Zentrum der modernen Diskussion steht, des modernen Lebens.
I describe myself as a humanist Marxist, and for the following reason, not just because I feel good about humanity. In our tradition of the British left, from 1956 right the way through to the fall of the Soviet Union, we were lucky enough to have communists who had broken with communism. So not Trotskyists, not anarchists, but people who have been very clearly in the communist Moscow tradition, who broke after the Hungarian invasion there. And the most important one for me is Edward Thompson. E.P. Thompson is sometimes called. He was the major historian of the British working class. Thompson wrote in 1978 a book which is a polemic against the French philosopher Louis Althusser. And in it he said this, this is almost my credo too. I've come to the conclusion that there are two Marxisms, and they are not compatible. They're not two wings of the same philosophy. They're diametrically opposed, and they must be at war with each other. Thompson said, okay, maybe my Marxism, the humanist Marxism, is wrong. What do I do? If I'm wrong, he said, if the only right Marxism is the anti-humanist Marxism that says history is a machine, history is a process without a subject. Thompson even said, I will retreat to liberalism. I'd rather be a liberal than a Marxist who supports dictatorship. No, I don't want to retreat to liberalism, but I do think that we need to situate historical materialism, the form of inquiry into social life that looks for economic roots and social roots for ideas. That's got to be a tradition, said Thompson, of critical reason. Not only can our conclusions be proved wrong, so maybe the theory of fascism of Georgy Dimitrov in 1935 is clearly wrong and it's outvoted. But even our premises, even Marxism itself, has to be subject to critical reason. So that's the tradition I come from. And it's what I'm trying to do in this book. The other side is a form of theology. And it's really interesting that, in fact, their theology, the saints in their theology, are not Stalin and Dimitrov, but Foucault, Althusser, and ultimately Nietzsche. Not Carl Schmitt. The fascination of Chantal Mouffe with Carl Schmitt, I just think is just wrong. It's a mistake she makes. Okay? I don't think Schmitt is a realist in this sense. He doesn't describe reality. Let's leave that aside. There is a book, if you're interested in this debate, there is a book literally this thick. It's the biggest book I've ever bought by the recently deceased Italian scholar Domenico Nocerno about Nietzsche. And I can sum it up in one sentence. There is no innocent Nietzsche. This guy who, yes, of course, wrote beautiful aphorisms, questioned everything. Incidentally, it wasn't Nietzsche who discovered God is dead. He just discovered that if God is dead, there is no moral philosophy. And that's what the intellectual underpinnings of fascism are. And that nature is more important than history. For me, the critique of fascism has to start with a philosophical critique of Nietzsche, and it therefore means engaging with him. And what is the first thing that happens when you engage with Nietzsche critically is that his supporters say, no, but you've misunderstood him. You're not really understanding what this particular aphorism means. No, it's perfectly clear what it means. He was a theorist of, he wasn't an anti-Semite, but he was a theorist of racial supremacy and of gender supremacy. That's the root of it. So anyone who's in favour of it has to first of all give that. On your first question, I forgot what it was. I wrote, remind me.
Portugal, Spain.
Yeah, okay. No, I don't think the problem is that Germany and Italy haven't properly looked at their past. I think it's something much more easy to understand. Putin has targeted Italian and German society, or for a long time. I don't just mean with kind of proxy agents, I mean with a kind of strategy. I think the other country that he's targeted for a long time is Austria. And what are the results? The Austrian foreign ministry, the Austrian government under Sebastian Kurz was very, very pro-Putin. Okay? I don't say that the SPD's Ostpolitik strategy was necessarily wrong. I'm not such a big critic of the Ostpolitik as some people are, because geographically it makes sense to have an Ostpolitik if you're dependent on energy. The problem is, how did you get to become dependent on energy, and why did key members of the SPD elite enthusiastically embrace Putin's regime? That's the problem. Now, I want to finish by saying this. I am actually in favour, because this is such a big change in history that we are going through with this war. I've said in my own country, let's have an amnesty. You know, yes, I know people on the left, on the far left, who have travelled to Donbass, posed with the Donbass far-right separatists. I just say to them, look, you didn't expect this, did you? Let's just forget about this. You made a mistake. I'd say to Johnson, he took all the money from the Russian oligarchs, but he did the right thing in terms of sending arms eventually to Ukraine. I'm in favour of a critical amnesty for everybody who made mistakes. We need our own society to be as homogeneous as possible, to be as unified as possible, to take everybody with us on the task of confronting, facing down Putin's imperialist, genocidal, ethno-nationalist imperialism. So even if German society is at the moment very scratchy about Ostpolitik and Putin Versteher, yes, okay, I want to convince them rather than simply insult them. I just want to try and bring them along on the ride. The ride's not going to be a pleasant one.
Okay.
Sorry, you used a long question, so I gave you a long answer.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Paul.
Ist noch eine Frage?
Ja.
Wollt ihr noch weitermachen oder machen wir noch Fragen?
Also ich würde sagen, machen wir noch eine Frage, ja, auf jeden Fall. Ja.
Mike? You hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. My question is, how do you think the climate crisis ties into the development of fascist ideas, and whether there are possibilities of using it as a means to defeat it? It surprised me yesterday to heard it was news here. A Green Minister of the Economy wants to use coal-fired plants.
So, and we'll make this the last question because I can see some people need to go. But, okay, so briefly, right-wing populism typically denies climate change, denies man-made climate change, and they're against wind farms. UKIP in my country, against wind farms, deny climate change. Fascism, and this is a key difference, accepts climate change is happening. Why? Because for them, it's the golden opportunity to stage what they call Day X, the final meltdown of Western society in an ethnic civil war. So they're really enthusiastic. This partly explains why they do so much preparation. You notice they don't rush from the beer cellar in a premature uprising. They are waiting for climate change to create chaos, so that 1.5 million refugees from Syria becomes 10 million from maybe India when there is a 50-degree heat wave. It's also the case that in the case of what we call eco-fascists, the climate narrative is very central. There was a guy in Finland called Pentti Linkola who wrote that the Earth, because fascists are always substitute history politics with nature politics. They're obsessed with the natural state of human beings and indeed the Earth. And if you notice, they always have either an animal, a mountain, or a tree that represents. They think certain animals, trees, and mountains represent the national spirit of the people's spirit. Right. So Linkola said the Earth can only support 2 billion people, and so So of the 7 billion, 5 billion need to disappear. He didn't explain how they would disappear, but we can imagine. And this is what the thought I will leave you with. I hope it makes you not despairing, but hopeful. Because these guys, in Washington on the 6th of January, the Trump supporters, some fascist Trump supporters, wore a t-shirt that said 6 million is not enough. When I fought the fascist skinheads in the 1970s, they said 6 million didn't die. Today, they say 6 million is not enough. They're thinking in big numbers. And climate change helps them to think in big numbers. They're obsessed, I pointed out in the book, the evidence is in the book, they're obsessed with genocide. In a way that the average Sturmabteilung guy in 1932 was not that obsessed with genocide because they didn't know what it looked like. They know what it looks like. And so I think we can mobilise. The young generation already is mobilised to, in Fridays for the Future, in My Country, Extinction Rebellion. They are the most educated generation ever. They know that if climate chaos is allowed to happen, they know what politics will become. And this is the great incentivizer for us to fight for radical change on climate. I'd also add one final thing. A world in which Putin and Xi Jinping divide the world and impose totalitarianism and end international law is a world that will not defeat climate change. So we need to just realise that this is the struggle of the century. And I think when you say can we use climate change against them or to undermine their message, I think in the end, yes, because we must cling to one fact, that zero net carbon is a possibility through radical change. They have to hope that zero net carbon never happens. And I think that's what the simplest question to put to your 11-year-old child is what kind of a world you want to live in. One with zero net carbon and a survivable planet, or we now know what the politics of the non-survivable planet will look like. And I hope that that most educated generation ever will go to the streets, go to the universities, go to the workplaces and defeat fascism.
This was a lesson in philosophy, this was a lesson in politics, in a short way. Thank you very much.
And thank you to the audience for staying here and being so attentive and so brilliant. Thank you.
And read the book, and the author will sign it now. Okay.
Thanks so much for being here. I hope not for the last time. And ja, und ich würde euch bitten, also erstmal vielen Dank, dass ihr da wart. Ich fand es auch eine super gute Diskussion. Alle Leute, die so ein Headset haben, dass ihr das einfach da vorne in diesen Koffer legt, wo auch die anderen liegen oder reinsteckt. Genau, vielen Dank, dass ihr hier da wart. Draußen ist ein Bücherstand, also wer möchte, kann sein mitgebrachtes Buch von Paul signieren lassen. Ansonsten könnt ihr draußen bei der Büchergilde auch noch ein Buch erwerben. Und ich wünsche euch einen schönen Abend und ja, auf bald wieder im Gewerkschaftshaus zu einer unserer nächsten Veranstaltungen. Danke.